This is Generous Theology, and today Chuck and Brock are taking a look at Professor Black's work in Chapter 23, The Nature of Intellect, from the Cambridge History of Medieval Philosophy.
How's that for setting the context, Chuck? And how would you feel if you were one of these middle-aged thinkers in the shadow of these major movements?
It's interesting because there is a sense in which perhaps at times we see a criticism of the early medievals or even the late ancients for being so tied to the noumenal that they ignore some of the phenomenal. And we've talked about this before, right? Where the theories that were created to explain some of the phenomena of the astronomical bodies and things like that, in order to fit in with theories of how the noumenal portion of the world worked, got to be so complex as to almost fall under the weight of their complexity. And I see some of that there is a concern that you can be so focused on those that you avoid some of the phenomenal. You avoid the evidence that's right in front of you. At times, I've seen that in the way some people think about today. But then you can go so far the other way. And I think that's what we're seeing is that over time, we see that, and it perhaps helps that we read the 19th century stuff before we read this, but we can see the direction of being pushed in the direction of avoiding the noumenal, avoiding the supernatural as even being worthy of discussion or perhaps even existing that occurs in modernity. And you lose something there if all you're focused on is the phenomenal, and you lose any sense of supernatural, of the noumenal, however you want to describe that. And so I think there is a sense in which there are today people, not just, and obviously there are people of faith who have been pointing out that an entirely phenomenal way of looking at things, a very empirical way of looking at things, is missing an important part of the universe. But I do get the sense that there is, even outside of Christians, there is a growing sense in which we need to deal with the supernatural or the noumenal or the transcendent, perhaps, depending on how people look at the issues. Those words all have somewhat different meanings, but I think they all cap desire that people have for those things. Now, I think you and I, as Christians, we know where that desire comes from. It's often described by Christian apologists as being the God-sized hole in people's hearts that needs to be. But there is also a sense in which, yes, it is a God-sized hole in people's heart because God created a universe that has both the phenomenal and the noumenal, that has both things that we can perceive with our senses as humans, but which are also greater than. And we need to account for both of those things in the way that we think about it. And it does seem like that there is this back and forth that tends to happen where people want to focus on one or the other. They want to oversimplify one or the other. And that's not really the way God created the world. There's a sense as we talk about these things that I have an even greater appreciation for the good way that God created the universe, and including our intellects, including also just the very structure of reality, to include things that are not only things that we can see, but what's behind them, what's even greater than. And to some extent, that may be a reflection of, we're seeing in God's creation a reflection of himself as well. And therefore, even when we talk about God's image within human beings, we're talking about human intellect, right? And we're talking about some things that can be perceived, but we're talking about things that maybe go beyond that. That's also a reflection of God's image in us, in that he's created us to be more than just simply the sum of our parts, but to have a spiritual being as well, to have a part in that noumenal, even though it's not something that we easily perceive or understand.
Yeah, great discussion there. There's no easy way into drinking this fire hose. There's a lot of legwork involved to try to get established context, to try to understand what the thinkers are actually saying and speaking about and talking about. And so I appreciate this chapter for giving us that in a nice distilled form. Now, there was an interesting point that is brought up here, and that is this idea that in the Arabic and Jewish philosophical tradition, in some sense, the human animal, the human being, is one unified whole. And this is a very interesting different development from the individualization seemed to come out of the Christian West, perhaps especially the Latin West, where, Chuck, you and I are different individuals, and while we're both humans, we are not particularly connected. You and I are separate, we're independent. In some sense, you are you and you are not me, but then you have this idea of the organic unity of the race. And I found that really interesting because it perhaps ties into the biblical doctrine of the federal representation of Adam. So our first human parents in the garden, our Reformed doctrine is that they fell into sin, and their sinful nature was imputed to our account. And let me rephrase that. Their sinful activity, the guilt of that, was imputed to our account. And on top of that, their sinful nature, that is the tendency to do evil rather than to do the good, came to us, so that just as rabbits give birth to rabbits and orange trees grow new orange trees, so too sinners bring forth sinners. And so there's this organic relationship there, this federal relationship, that I wonder if it ties into this. And I was really struck by that. I babysit for a beautiful young little lady, and she asks me about what it's like being married to my wife. And I tell her that I and my wife are one. And so if you went over to my wife right now and hit my wife, you would be hitting me. Of course, the look on her face of disbelief, of incredulity, of what's going on here is special. And so what's going on there? You know, I wish to maintain, based on the scriptural data, that in some real and admittedly mystical way that the scriptures don't particularly give us the scientific explanation for, I and my wife are one. But even more than that, I am one with my neighbor in solidarity, in identity, and I should be concerned for his welfare because he is me and I am him in some, again, mystical sense. But there is that tie, there is that connection there that came out of this. And I just wanted to throw that over to you. And how did that part strike you? And how do we work within that mystical situation?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I think I think you have a really good example in talking about the marriage relationship and how we're one. And we see that we actually do see that terminology used in scripture when it comes to the marriage relationship. There's also even beyond that. In the Apostles' Creed, we talk about the communion of the saints. And what does that mean, the communion of the saints? And in our congregation, our pastor, before we say the Apostles' Creed, which we do he talks about this idea that we are part of the communion of saints in reciting the Apostles' Creed because it was first written 1,700 years ago, and it reflects the core beliefs of Christians from all times and places, all over the world, and all sorts of different languages. And he often focuses on even in just the fact that we're saying the Apostles' Creed, that we are in doing that, showing ourselves to be part of that communion of saints that we talk about in the Apostles' Creed. What does that mean? What does it mean to be part of the communion of saints? It is interesting how you identify that. It almost seemed to be stronger in Islamic and Jewish thinking than it was in some of the medieval Christian thinking. But this idea that perhaps there is something about the intellect that is more than just individual, that goes beyond the individual, that in some way is a unity, in some ways could be seen as reflecting that Christian idea. And yet there's also a sense in which it is very much part of the Christian way of thinking to understand that, but we are also still individuals. We're not merely parts of a larger organism, but we also have some being in and of ourselves. Now, where I usually think about that is in terms of how do we think about God, right? How do we think about the Trinity? And we talk about the persons of the Trinity. And so there's a sense in which the persons of the Trinity have some level of individuality. While they are persons of the Trinity, we still can talk about God as a unity. Now, I think it's perhaps going too far to say humans are exactly the same. Instead of a trinity, it's billions of a T. But it is neat to see how there is in our ability to think about things like intellect in thinking about how do we use our minds to understand that there is something beyond just simply the individual, and that perhaps we can see reflections of God and God's image in the necessity that we have in understanding that we are something more than just simply individuals, even as we are individuals. So it's a neat thing. I'm not quite sure. One of the things that it was interesting, I know that Aquinas seemed to be a little critical of people who got too far into that way of thinking. He was concerned about individual salvation as part of that, and an understanding that we do as individuals, that there is a sense in which we are saved as individual beings. And yet I know too that there's, even as we go beyond that, in Reformed ways of thinking, we often talk about the covenant, right? The covenant of believers and covenant communities and the way that they interact and the role that they have in bringing people to faith, and the role of the church in doing that and bringing people together, that it isn't just simply I choose to follow God, therefore I'm going to be a Christian, and I choose not to. There's something far beyond that, even beyond just simply the fact that we can't in and of ourselves choose because we're so overpowered by sin. But even getting beyond that truth, there is a sense in which our salvation plays out using these larger, God uses these larger communities as a way to bring that out, which is also, again, plays a little bit into that. How do we think about the way we think? What impact does the fact that I have a neighbor and they're thinking certain ways, how does that impact the fact that I'm thinking? And I know that psychologists and sociologists are thinking about those very issues today, and that there is this back and forth about, hey, we're all discrete individuals, and there are psychologists who would be really focused on, hey, we're all discrete individuals, we're ourselves, we're unique. We have to be careful about being too broad, lining people up and that we all think the same because of the group. But then there are those who really see an important kind of thing in the learn. And we're seeing those things in the way that Avicenna and Averroes and then later European thinkers are thinking about the intellect and these parts of the intellect. How do they work? What is the relationship to the soul and to individual human beings? It's really interesting.